the Edge 11 a.m. edition. I am Adela Hunter. I'm a Marie Curie Fellow here at the Institute of Contemporary History, and it is my great pleasure to be moderating today's presentation. We have with us Naum Trajanovski, who is one of the current research fellows at the Institute, an adjunct faculty member at the Robert Zając Institute for Social Studies at the University of Warsaw. Naum holds a PhD in sociology from the Institute of Philosophy and Sociology at the Polish Academy of Sciences, and his major academic interests include historical sociology, the history of sociology in Central and Southeast Europe, nationalism, and memory studies. Naum will present for us today his latest book, A History of Macedonian Sociology in Quest for Identity, which came out with Palgrave in 2024, and is the first English language monograph about the institutional development of sociology in North Macedonia. Naum, I will give the word to you, and after that we will have questions from the audience, both in presence and online.
Okay. Thank you very much, Adela. Thank you very much for the colleagues at the Institute for this very kind of, for me, important opportunity to present this book in such a format. So far, there were only 2 events where this book was discussed. The first one was in Skopje, and I'm very happy about that. As it was discussed within this kind of wider framework of like Macedonian sociologists, and also like some older senior colleagues were there, and it was not necessarily a book presentation, but rather a kind of a more festive celebration of the history of the Macedonian sociology. And the second one was rather one-on-one discussion of the book in Sofia at the Center for Advanced Studies with Chavdar Marinov, who actually himself gave a pretty great introduction to the book. So I'm very, very grateful again for this opportunity and for this kind of chance to stress my major findings, at least what I consider my major findings, and maybe not so major findings, but yet, I mean, interesting for me at least. So, as you know, this book is part of the Palgrave series on histories of national sociologists, and hence it had this inborn kind of goal of providing the history of sociology in a longer span against this backdrop of changing national borders and titular nations. So what I deem first and foremost Macedonian sociology is hence this corpus of materials dealing with sociological and quasi-sociological topics in Macedonian, which can certainly be grasped as this kind of methodological and ideographic whole, together with the short but very intense kind of institutional history of sociology in Macedonia. The second point, I build up upon one kind of emic, more far-ranging perspective on its history, which designates as Macedonian all the attempts to sociologize the Macedonian nation and state building. And from this standpoint, the qualifying criterion is, of course, not necessarily the language in which it was delivered, but rather the discursive content and the sociopolitical aspiration. So this approach, this kind of double approach, was this leeway to reach to the interwar period, and even a bit beyond in the book, although this sort of proto-sociological and this sort of proto-sociological reasoning won't be discussed today. So we will start today by examining interwar Skopje, then part of the newly established kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, afterwards Yugoslavia, and I will briefly present the institutional history of the Faculty of Philosophy in Skopje and the work and activities of 3 particular scholars. And this will be, in a way of pinning down and contrasting the different sociological and pseudo-sociological insights and research during this period of time and their political resonance. So in order to cover as much of the chronology as possible, I will continue to focus on people throughout today's presentation, since some of their major intellectual projects embody the best the shifting research and political agendas in this kind of longer span of approximately a century I'm covering. So the second period in this regards is related to State Socialist Macedonia. Of course, the federal unit of the second Yugoslavia from 45 to 91. And this is also a period when Macedonia gained state status for the first time, and the language was of course standardized along with the other identity markers. So as in the book, I will compartmentalize this period into 3 sub-periods, given the kind of steering thematic interests and institutional arrangements. And the very final period pertains to contemporary Republic of Macedonia, North Macedonia, as you know, as of 2018. And I won't go into this panoramic kind of presentation of all the sociological activities, but rather I'll present what I consider the most significant public debate involving sociological expertise, and that is, of course, the debate about the prospects of the Macedonian multiculturalism. So, after the devastating decade of 1910, the 1920s saw great unrest in then South Serbia, as the imperial order was being transformed into a nation state. The general policy response was one of Serbization of the local population, which involved, among others, a strong grip of the education process. And the Faculty of Philosophy in Skopje was thereby established in 1920 as the first ever tertiary educational institution in what is nowadays Macedonia, as a branch of the Belgrade University. The faculty and the several mostly research circles it hosted drew on this paradigmatic anthropogeography of Jovan Cvijić as an attested method which successfully drew the outer borders of the kingdom at Versailles. So Cvijić also advanced these 2 major theses about Macedonia and its population at the turn of the century, which were based on this longer fieldwork and the idea to once for all solve the Macedonian question based on empirical data and insights. So he ended up differentiating the Macedonian Slavs as a floating mass with an ethnic predisposition to become either Serbian or Bulgarian, depending more on the liberation prospects and less on the historical or linguistic distinctiveness. As for the second point, he proposed an ethno-psychological typology of the South Slavs, and listing the Macedonian Slavs among the Central Balkan type, which, for instance, he deemed more emotional and prone to suffering in comparison to the Dinaric type of Serbia proper. So these 2 ideas shaped the interwar period, the interwar thought about the local society, as the vast majority of sociological ventures appeared as direct responses to these claims by Cvijić. So the first person I want to show you in this context is Dušan Nedeljković, a philosopher of Serbian ethnic origins holding a doctorate from Sorbonne and a Bergsonian turned Marxist who came to Skopje in 1922, immediately after his kind of completion of the studies in France. So he soon emerged as the main animator of the local leftist students, but also teachers relocating in the Macedonian peripheries, as in a Yugoslav Siberia. And this is actually his kind of quotation. Nedeljković was among the first to challenge Cvijić's vision of Macedonia, and in particular his idea that the South Serbs constitute a separate central group. Nedeljković drew upon beyond anthropogeographical methods such as quantitative surveys and psychotechnical measurements of the aesthetic sensitivities and the mnemonic capacities of the locals, as well as an updated conceptual apparatus, including ethological and sociological notions, to claim that the locals are actually a subgroup of the Dinaric type of Serbia proper. The second figure here is Petronije Prvaš Slankamenac, who was of a different ideological provenance than Nedeljković as an emerging right-wing intellectual with a doctorate in psychology of religion from Zagreb, yet very much in sync when it comes to the interpretation of the local ethnic particularities. So contrary to Nedeljković, for whom Skopje was some sort of an ostracism in a way, Slankamenac was actually given this opportunity to establish the first ever sociological seminary in Skopje in 1930, and as a way of putting his pedagogical ideas into practice. So in brief, against this background of the old Yugoslav debate that sought to envision the cultural politics of the new state, Slankamenac articulated a pragmatist argument in favor of the communal élan vital as a means of fueling its artistic genius and vernacular beliefs. And he, in a way, backed this practical engagement with scholarship, developing a pretty neat comparative analysis of 4 local hagiographies of Anhorites based on oral and written accounts. And he was interested in tracing their utilitarian character in creating social solidarities, which in a way was, as far as I see it, was a pretty novel approach in the Yugoslav context at this particular period, relatable, for instance, to the one of Stefan Czarnovski's far more famous coterminous interpretation of the Latin hagiographies of Saint Patrick. The third person was a local, actually, Boris Arsic, or Boris Arsov, who studied law in France and got, in a way, directly exposed to the French sociology, which provided him the scientific apparatus to question the prevailing modes of deliberating about the society back in his homeland. And opposite to Nedeljković and Slanka Menas, he was never affiliated with the faculty of philosophy. So in a way, he embarked upon a project of investigating the centripetal forces and the political ambitions of the local society based on these Durkheimian collective representations, while openly criticizing the geographism of Cvijić and his school, and this kind of, as he deemed, metaphysicism of ethnopsychology. And he argued, for instance, that the agrarian reform in the southernmost province of the kingdom failed due to the neglect of the social and psychological needs of the local population, and offered a historical map of drivers of this, as he saw it, national emancipation, which was a model against the anthropogeographical takes on Macedonia in all their nuances, as they predominantly saw the local population as intact and static. So the aftermath of the Second World War saw a radically new social and political constellation, yet against the portrayal of early communist blacklisting of Yugoslav sociology as an interruption of its pre-war life, I argue that the regime change in Macedonia was extraordinarily porous in terms of sociological and social scientific methodologies and habits of observation. And this was due to the fact that the main intellectual horizons were calibrated by the challenge to legitimize the formation of such a state from a Marxist-Leninist perspective. So against this classic Marxism, which saw the national bourgeoisie as a condition sine qua non not only for a proletarian revolution, but also for the establishment of nation states, the first post-war generation of Macedonian sociologists aimed at adjusting the historical to the political canon. So the several episodes of controlled transgressions in the early post-war period were hence of ideological rather than national nature, such as the case, for instance, of the late interwar period and Arsic or Arsov. So Desa Miljovska, who you see here, and she actually later co-initiated the first sociological chair in Skopje, was one of the first to articulate a convincing thesis legitimizing the socialist Macedonian state, and drawing upon French archives and the pre-war literature, which, although nationally contaminated, was ready to be reread in this novel key. Miljovska developed a thesis about the arrested development of the industrialization in Macedonia, which eventually halted the full formation of local bourgeoisie. And this thesis became dominant in the 50s, informing empirical research, even some very interesting empirical research, and setting the tone of this early national historiography. So here, Dancho Zogravski, who was actually a kind of this sociologically versed historian, also Germanophone economic historian and part of this first generation of Macedonian historians, similarly to Miljovska, was also part of this early post-war elite Marxist intelligentsia, embarked upon a corresponding task of tracing the capitalist elements in 18th and 19th century Macedonia, before concluding that the failure to develop Macedonian bourgeoisie was an outcome of the sudden jump from this kind of semi-feudal Ottoman social structure to this aggressive and already non-Macedonian capitalist relations of production. Okay, so the process of institutionalization of sociology in Socialist Republic of Macedonia went through all the ontogenetic phases as in the other Yugoslav centers in the course of the 50s and the early 60s, and some faster. Some aspects were even faster, such as the formation of the Association of Philosophy and Sociology in 1962, 3 years earlier than the Slovene one, for instance, and the Specialized Institute for Sociological, Political and Juridical Research in 1965, while some other aspects were even slower, such as the creation of sociological chair and the specialized sociological journal. So, however, in this very context, I argued that it took several more years for Macedonian sociology to acquire this label of a resolute discipline, which occurred as a result of several other events. So first, here is this catastrophic earthquake that hit Skopje in July 1963, and in a way provoked massive relief operation, but also boosted the socio-technical imaginaries of a local group of social sciences who sought to mobilize their expertise in this kind of state of emergency. And ultimately, this kind of process helped autonomizing sociological criticism by articulating what stood in contrast to the socialist modernist project of post-earthquake Skopje, be it in relation to the immediate post-disaster challenges or the practical operationality of the Yugoslav self-management. This period also saw the largest and the most systematically organized survey ever conducted in Macedonia, and that is, of course, the collaborative study of Polish-Macedonian team under the baton of the UN, which I discuss at length in the book, but also in a separate article. The second point here pertains to the political changes during the 1960s, which brought a more liberal cohort of politicians to the leadership of the Republican League of Communists, which in a way saw this emerging vision of empirical sociology as an ideal fit for demonstrating the new commitment to informed policymaking. Funding was secured not only by political but also by industrial enterprises under the new schemes of self-management in research, granting almost a third of the empirical studies in the state by the 1970s. All this resulted in a pretty open research of the political participation against this emerging delegate system, with some of its main representatives, such as Slavko Milosavljević, being part of the top decision-making process during this period. The third point relates to this escalation of the bilateral Bulgarian-Yugoslav/Macedonian relations in the mid-1960s over issues concerning Macedonian history, identity, and language, among the others. So the Macedonian liberal leadership sought to propose a reconciliatory Marxist formula based on the rejection to attribute national qualifications to the pre-capitalist past, which would in effect lessen the tensions about pure and falsified history. So the major such project pertained to Dragan Taškovski, who offered an alternative Macedonian ethnogenesis based on a rather Kardelian reading of the late modern history. So, for instance, the halt of the national program was now seen, contrary to Miljovska and Zogravski discussed before, was now seen as a matter of arrested intellectual mobilization rather than economic deprivation of the Macedonian merchants, since Macedonian intellectuals were easily co-opted to work for the neighboring agendas due to the lack of medieval statehood tradition of the Macedonian nation. However, although empty-handed in terms of medieval tradition, he observed the local intellectual interests in the as he deems antediluvian colossi, such as Alexander the Great, as an agential strategy that highlights the similar patterns of the delayed Macedonian and the other national mobilizations in the region. So Taškovski and Alexander Hristov, the first director of the Sociological Institute in Skopje, a lawyer himself, but very much kind of fond of this history of legal history approach, picked up this notion of delayed nation building and applied it to the period of the Macedonian revolutionary organization, hence managing to help sociology autonomize from the cognate historical and ethnographic discourses. And now we're moving to the 70s, which in a way were marked by this, as in the words of Milosavljević, this conservative counter-offensive in the state, but also beyond, and in a way brought back, empowered the circle of Kolishevsky, in a way his kind of inner circle. So, and the new party line deemed public criticism and the many currents in the party unwelcome. And against this background, the first and second generations of Macedonian sociologists continued its institutionalization while looking for refactorizing their professional expertise, which was in a way rapidly losing significance. So in the book, I trace the many educational and research adjustments during this period, mapping out several individual trajectories against this backdrop of shifting leverage of sociological research. This precarious position also made the relatively small Macedonian sociological community to navigate between oftentimes competing platforms and standpoints in this period, such as the more official and dogmatic one, represented by the now aging first generation of scholars, and the emerging younger generation of social scientists who had different ideas about the state prospects. And the journal Dialogue, the cover of which you are seeing on the slide, launched in 1972 by the Macedonian Students Association, was an epitome of this later credo, although it was published only twice before getting banned. So against this general intellectual background, the editorial team called for a reconsidering of the peripheral positions of the state, but also the dogmatic mainstream in a way. The second critical episode from this late socialism was the launch of yet another Polish-Macedonian sociological cooperation, and this time in the format of the series of Krakow-Skopje sociological meetings, starting from 1979 and making all the way through the post-socialism and in a way till nowadays, although in different formats. The topics up until the 90s included industrialization, urbanization, self-management, and rural sociology, while this formula appeared to be rewarding for the two sociological communities, especially for the Macedonians, as it was an instant resolution to this provincialization complex, as Polish sociology at that point was perceived as this well-situated, even westward-looking one. So, as of 1991, the then Republic of Macedonia entered this turbulent era of domestic and regional challenges to its independence and sovereignty. Among them, the institutionalization of the delicate interethnic equilibrium emerged as one of the major political themes, structuring in a way the political process in the three post-Yugoslav decades. So in this new political context, however, the context allowed for a novel reimagining of the social role of the sociologists, now taking the role of public intellectual custodians of the then popular cultural pluralist paradigm in the Macedonian context. And in the words of Maria Tasheva, a senior sociologist from the Institute of Sociology in Skopje, almost all local sociologists showed interest in this topic in the 90s. Up until the 2001 armed conflict in Macedonia, the major debate pertained to the questions of institutional isomorphism, that is, the need for and the extent of importing multicultural policies from other, mostly Western and liberal democratic contexts. And against this, several attempts at articulating idiosyncratic Macedonian model of multiculturalism, defined by its rather traditional set of mechanisms for pacifying conflicts, which can be disturbed by, in a way, it was perceived to be disturbed by this external legal and ideological implants, the local sociologists attempted to be as precise as possible by invoking, on the one hand, different scholarly and policy contexts, and on the other, by demonstrating that the empirical evidence suggests that the notion of traditional cultural pluralism is virtually non-existent on a micro scale. The various studies of ethnic distance, urban development, and political culture in the 90s all confirmed, in a way, this position. The violent escalation in 2001 worsened the perception and the quality of interethnic relations in the state, while the settlement, the so-called Ohrid Framework Agreement, shifted the debate towards the eventual pitfalls of the model of accommodating ethnic and religious diversities. And contrary to the 1990s, attempts at hypostatizing the local histories of tolerance, the critical discourse was now primarily focused on the contemporary tools for reaching political consensus. And the novel debate involved two camps, again, that is one which saw the settlement along with its downsides as an opportunity for the state, and the other camp which actually rejected it as an infringement of the liberal and civic state fundaments. The first camp, again, was predominantly consisted of sociologists and social anthropologists who mostly argued that the stipulated set of legal provisions allow for an advancement of democracy in an ethnically divided society. So, please allow me now to try at least and make sense of this all name dropping of today and this kind of very, very vague panoramic overview. So the first point, and you clearly notice that my approach was not necessarily an exclusive one of a strict history of sociology, but rather intellectual history of social sciences with bits of institutional history in the first part, knowledge transfers and sociology of sociology in the second, and political history in the third. And this experimental setting allowed me to show, I believe, that the different political constellations shaped local social scientific developments by providing the coordinates of research topics, means, and objectives. And this is especially relevant for the second period when the leading Marxist intellectuals instrumentalized the historical materialism to legitimize the existence of a Macedonian state and nation, thus providing for a somewhat atypical national sociological origination under state socialism. The second point, and this, in a way, this historical account was used to map the ramified extensions in all periods, tracing a set of continuities and discontinuities along the way. For instance, what prevailed from the interwar period was the dominant data gathering method, whose results were now read in different national and ideological key. On the other hand, the early articulations of local agency, based, for instance, on the late Ottoman economic reforms, were sidelined as unfit, since the new ideological architects sought to present this period in a more negative light, thus aiming to cement the argument about the arrested development of the national society at the turn of the 19th century. So more recently, for instance, this kind of question of continuities and discontinuities reappeared as this active quest for a new outpost of the sociological research in the 1980s, which in a way, as I see it, culminated in a new political constellation where sociological expertise appeared to be more objective in a way and insightful regarding the challenges pertaining to the ethnic identities and the inter-ethnic relations in the state. Finally, my third point relates to this very possibility of narrating the history of Macedonian sociology from a methodological nationalism perspective, as both its institutional and intellectual development were tied to other national domains and emerged both owning to and opposing them. So this cross-national intertwining of sociology and sociologists appears in the interwar period, of course, with Cvijić and his school, and reappears in the post-Second World War period, having in mind the academic networks and infrastructures of Second Yugoslavia. So I tried to trace the national niche against this very backdrop, not by mechanically decoupling the Macedonian sociological developments from them, but rather by using different sort of strategies. And in the book, and I argue this, in a way, it can be seen also in the title, I argue that these multiculturalist prospects, although differently understood in the course of the decades, remained, in a way, this kind of structuring feature all along the way, which I'm tracing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Naum. This was wonderful. I have prepared a couple of questions for you, but I won't take that much time because I'm sure there are questions in the audience as well. Let me ask my first question, which is a follow-up exactly to your last sentence or your last reflection on how this, by being national history of sociology, or a history of national sociology, it also ended up being a history of how sociologists grapple with the very idea of nation. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering, first of all, is this correlated? So did you end up writing a history of their engagement with nation because you had to, in a way, write a history of Macedonian sociology? This is the first part. And the second part is, what else was there in terms of Marxist thinking that was not necessarily focused on, let's say, nation or ethnic inequalities, but on other forms of social inequality, such as class or gender, let's say. So was there some sort of usable tradition of Marxist social thought and social criticism that I imagine would have been based also on empirical research of various kind of processes of socialist modernization, industrialization, urbanization, and so on. Was there something of this kind? I would imagine around the late 60s, early 70s, when it became more common throughout socialist Eastern Europe. And can we still draw on this as a resource for today's anti-capitalist struggles and fights for social justice? And were there any attempts in the post-socialist period to return to some of this more progressive Marxist social criticism? So, okay, 4 questions in one, but take them as you wish.
Okay, so let me maybe start with this second one about the Marxist thought in general. I mean, the way I see it is in a way related to this compartmentalization of the state socialist past in Macedonia, given mostly the political kind of borders, which were kind of in a way shaping the very notion of research and as I mentioned, what they gave practically the upper hand of what is to be researched, discussed, and in a way published to a certain extent. So the engagement with kind of this classic Marxism and in a way this Marxist tradition was there. It's very much present, but in a way it reflects this kind of different political developments. So in the first period, in the 50s, and I even kind of discuss it at length in the book. In the 50s, the very kind of the dominant line is very much in favor of this rather dogmatic, I would say, thinking, mostly under the dominant kind of line of thinking about the nation and the state here. So in a way, here the whole kind of tension between history and sociology is not that clear at this point. So in a way, this is something which kind of translates differently in the second period, where this kind of more rather liberal opening is taking place. So here, for instance, at least for me, the most exciting kind of interpretations of Marxist interpretations of different sort of aspects of the social life are taking place. As you probably know, this is the period where actually the catastrophic earthquake kind of pushes very much the local sociological community to rethink some very, very kind of urgent issues in a rather experimental key, given the very kind of rushed experience of researching and publishing this sort of materials. So here, for instance, the very notion of testing the self-managerial kind of practice in a state of emergency is very interesting one, and kind of it was even highlighted later in the 70s as one of a very kind of original Marxist interpretation in this very context. Again, after the 70s, this very kind of conservative in a way atmosphere relegated this rather this topic to a different sort of domain. It's not necessarily that theory was not discussed at length. On the contrary, theory was discussed even more than the 60s, but it was a rather a refuge, a safe place to kind of to claim some things which are rather part of the dominant mainstream, rather than to kind of engage into some more kind of provocative statements and comments about the very political and social life in the country. The key figure here, I think also I forgot to mention maybe, is Slavko Milosavljeski again, who was a very interesting figure, a sociologist slash politician himself, who was ousted from the party in 73, 74. And in a way, he also epitomizes these very processes, as he, for instance, was very eagerly participating in these several very interesting kind of research projects on the delegate system, the political representation, and in a way he kind of drew some empirical insights from there in his kind of major works from the late 60s pertaining to this rather democratized political perspective and in a way openings of the system to rather different groups. This in a way was in this kind of politics of Yugoslav, let's say, interminglings. This was immediately translated in Slovenian and Serbian. So this was like a work of which kind of gained the most prominence in this period. So I believe this is more or less kind of clear. As for the 90s, there is a very interesting, I mean, beside this national questions, which in a way, like, again, took the very kind of, took the practically the efforts and the energy of the majority of scholars. There are interesting kind of interesting rereadings of some of the works of the 60s, for instance, mostly pertaining to the urban planning, and in a way using the experience of the post-earthquake momentum to kind of criticize the novel urban plans for Skopje, especially, which were developed in the 90s. So, for instance, the first kind of urban sociologist, Ilya Acevsky, who was kind of in between the Faculty of Philosophy and the Institute of Sociological, Political and Juridical Science, was in a way this kind of formative figure who was able to kind of access both the surveys from the 60s, but also some of the other surveys from the 80s, in order to kind of come up with some other sort of arguments about the very present urban issues in the 90s. As for other, I don't have like some very direct example right now, but I'll mention if something comes up to my head in the course of the discussion. And yeah, was it correlated, the history of the well, it was indeed. I mean, this is I mean, I tried, in a way, I tried to escape this sort of even anecdotal, you know, like there are also similar kind of jokes about the Polish history thinking, you know, like under the period where actually there was no Polish state, and how every certain issue was kind of linked to the national question is rather similar. I mean, I think that this very issue of ontological security and the fact that this kind of complex of identity issues was questioned in the course of the decades from several and different perspectives, this in a way made this sort of corpus of materials the most visible ones, I would say, and the most even prominent. So against this background, I was trying to open up the perspectives on other issues, even practical. So even like including the perspectives of non-Macedonians who were active as sociologists. But again, even these kind of local sub-communities were very much engaging with the interethnic and the national question. So again, I mean, it is there. I tried to address it from as many perspectives as possible. But yeah, I hope at least that, you know, it's also something which will be picked up. Some gaps will be picked up in future by other people. So yeah, thank you very much.
Are there any questions in the audience?
Yeah. Thank you very much for your questions there, and also thank you for a very dense, rich overview. I'm interested in something that already started, discussion already started with your question, to be more specific on, or to tell us more on specific empirical research that existed within Yugoslavia, maybe based on collaborations of sociologists from different republics. Was there something like that? Were there some like influences that you follow, and what maybe if you compare Macedonian sociology to Slovenian sociology, were there like very different emphases and directions? And also to tell us more about collaborations in transnational arena. Not only you mentioned this collaboration with Krakow, Polish sociology. I'm also interested in the Western emphasis. Maybe sociologists went to the West to study abroad, and then they brought, imported some theoretical frames. I know that in industrial sociology, I'm more interested in industrial sociology, so on class issues, and industrial working class. So they went to study maybe in US or England, and they brought and imported were there some Western theoretical influences present in the 70s or 80s, and how that influenced maybe political economical change in Macedonia. So about concrete empirical research collaboration within Yugoslavia, then it's transnational collaborations and influences coming, I don't know, maybe from the East.
From the East, yeah.
Not
so
more
much.
on this, from the 60s on.
I see. Okay, thank you very much for the question. Yes, as for the Slovenian-Macedonian collaboration, I can respond, right? I mean,
Yeah,
okay. So as for the Macedonian-Slovenian ones, there were direct and very kind of formative experiences in this regard. So for instance, in the late 60s, it is already in the period when this first initial group of sociologists led by this kind of faculty of law circle of Čokrevski and Milosavljeski, they already kind of moved to the political domain. So what is left, and this is how I see it, of course, in a rather banalized way, this kind of new wave of mostly rural sociologists to emerge as leading at the Institute for Sociological, Political and Juridical Studies. And this, in a way, one of the first projects is this kind of mega project on rural sociology, which is taking place from the late 60s. Ilya Josifovsky is the main figure here, alongside with his several kind of assistants, research assistants, who will emerge to be the leading sociologists in the coming years. So this project is rather large. It involves mapping of the Polog region in Macedonia, as far as I remember, and it was the first time that they were, in a way, this is how they considered, and this is in a way very interesting to read in this kind of reflections from this very period, and this is in a way they consider themselves as doing some sort of a serious work for the first time. So not involving anecdotal kind of evidence and other sort of data gathering techniques, but rather a systematic systematic comparative case where actually the methodological and theoretical apparatus was provided up front. This is one thing. Second thing is something which I'm interested in right now. For instance, this late, depends where, but this late 60s, 70s episode of kind of flirting with these Western ideas of political systems. So for instance, mostly mediated by these various UNESCO networks of social scientific kind of science. So for instance, this whole idea of how the issues of interest groups, rule of law was domesticated, is something which is a rather cross-Yugoslav debate. It involves a lot of tensions and stuff. So for instance, Adolf Bibić was widely read in Macedonia, but also on the contrary, Milosavljeski was even present here at the Društvene vede, I believe. Also some other kind of proto-political scientists, Mirchev, and so this is again some sort of not necessarily that direct link, but rather a shared, I would say, intellectual tradition in this regard, as these people are very, very eagerly cross-referencing each other. So yeah, I believe this is, these two examples are enough at this point. I mean, I'm not necessarily an expert in the history of Slovenian sociology, but I was interested in all these kind of references which I was gathering while reading the Macedonians mostly. So as for the second question, beyond Krakow, I mean, yeah, this is a very, very funny even thing, because I'm myself living in Poland for almost 10 years, and these episodes of Polish-Macedonian kind of cross-national cooperations were just popping up. And it might even seem that it's like I'm even putting more attention than is even necessary. But in a way, they're not that many in these periods, and these in a way are so formative. On the other hand, so it would be a pity not to kind of provide the proper attention to them, especially since both this post-earthquake study, which is a very large kind of endeavor under the button of UN in a very kind of experimental manner. It's the whole history of the studies. It's very interesting. On the other hand, this Krakow Skopje series is one of the most long-lasting such cooperations in this part of the world. So yeah, I mean, I gave this attention due to this kind of more meritorical kind of aspects, not because of the fact that I was able to speak with the Polish Krakowian kind of sociologists who were able to to Skopje. So beyond this, yes, there is a very interesting opening to the West, mostly to this kind of European sociological networks. As of the 90s, the whole struggle here goes again in this very typical manner of recognizing the Macedonian sociology as Macedonian in the 90s, which is eventually successful. So this is considered, if you kind of check this kind of local sociological journals, this is considered the major success. And there is a strong opening to the Western sociological canon as of the 90s. So the works of the classics are being widely discussed, reconsidered. This, in a way, I would say it's yet another, maybe not so typical trans kind of national cooperation, but rather a new opening, a new kind of new vision of the Western canon of sociology. So again, it's not necessarily involving people coming to Skopje and kind of presenting these ideas, but rather attempts at domesticating this sort of canon in a different sort of political constellation. There is, of course, new generation. I mean, the person next to you, and there are many, many younger, like younger Macedonian sociologists who are able to kind of to study abroad. They do not necessarily return and work within these several major sociological centers in Skopje and the other cities. But nevertheless, I mean, the debate, as everywhere, is kind of taking new shapes. It's not necessarily pertaining to these more traditional formats of sociological journals published in Macedonia, but it kind of involves other funding agencies, not necessarily like only sociological. So yeah, I mean, this is the newest situation as far as I see it. In the book, there is a very kind of broad panoramic map of these developments, and yeah, I mean, it's such a dynamic process that it's hard to kind of pin all these things at once. But yeah, I try to be as inclusive as possible. Thank you.
There's another question.
Thank you for your presentation. My name is Jana. Slovene Sociological Association this year commemorates its 60th anniversary, so I think it's really interesting to see how Slovene sociology, if I'm sticking to your language, and I'll come to that, originates from the School of Law in Zagreb, Croatia, the kernel, the source of sociology in Yugoslavia at that time. And my question here is still, I'm still downloading, so it's still for me, please bear with me. But given the title of your book, A History of Macedonian Sociology, and your presentation kind of really sticking to that linguistic form of Macedonian sociology, why have you chosen to talk about the Macedonian sociology rather than sociology of Macedonia or sociology within Macedonia? It's just, it's a really genuine linguistic question.
Yes, okay.
It's not to tap into the politics of it, but I really am curious, particularly with your subtitle.
Yeah. Well, you know, I mean, as I mentioned in the very beginning of this presentation, so like allow me to maybe a bit repeat myself. I was following this two-party approach. On the one hand, it's very clear that what I consider Macedonian sociology is the corpus of materials written in Macedonian. So this is, of course, something which is to be traced back up to 45, 46. Even though the first kind of sociological works, unpublished, appeared already in the late 40s. So this is one of the major kind of leading definition of what I consider Macedonian sociology. But nevertheless, there is this emic tradition, so local tradition of considering as Macedonian all these attempts to sociologize the Macedonian nation building. And I build upon this tradition. I mean, this is something which, for instance, the kind of provoked by this all Yugoslav attempt at grasping the Yugoslav sociological past in the 70s. This Petar Georgievski was the figure who was actually trying to trace the earliest formats of Macedonian sociology, and he actually stopped at the interwar period. So it's a local mode of knowledge production about what is considered Macedonian. And in a way, I kind of built upon this approach and tried to explain what is there, what is considered as Macedonian by these sort of principles. So it's not necessarily it's not, I mean, the major focus is not put on this in the book, but it's there as a rather prehistorical kind of context of what is to be discussed and worked on in the aftermath, mostly in the interwar period. I mean, it's hard to speak about proper sociology even before the interwar period in many other more kind of developed national contexts as such. So yeah, I mean, this is how I see it. This is the two kind of the two approaches which are considered enough for depicting what Macedonian is in this regards.
I will read out a question from Zoom.
Okay.
This is coming from Lucia,
okay.
Who you would have hoped to be here, but she's on Zoom with us. And she is asking, how do the attitudes towards ethnic, national, and obviously social mixing change through these different phases?
Okay.
Does this feature as a topic beyond the question of integration of colonists into local societies and outside of the project of Yugoslavism? Also, has this been written about by minority sociologists or sociologists studying different minorities? Or has this been covered by other disciplines? What are the main differences between Marxist and non-Marxist approaches to this question?
Okay. Maybe we can gather right now the questions, or is it like, because I saw that there are several others?
Yeah, Masha, go ahead.
So I'm interested, you said that the students of sociology had this journal, dialogue, and I'm interested, what else did they do? Did they just have the journal, or did they maybe do some other things, and are they still active? Is there still like student groups that are active in Macedonia?
Okay. And one more.
Yeah, let's take it. Go.
Thank you very much. Just a quick question. So given the centrality of this identity-related issues which you discussed in the previous presentation, I was wondering, especially in the post-independence period, and especially maybe today, is there any sense of like articulating any kind of global positionality, positionality in the global context, and maybe picking up on this current global debates on decolonial sociology and all that? Because as fellow Macedonian diasporic social scientist, I've been in touch with the debate, but also not in touch, so I'm actually genuinely asking.
Okay, so three questions. Lucia, first about the interethnic kind of complex. Yes, I mean, from a rather practical perspective, it's a very good point, because it was not necessarily the case that minority sociologists or social sciences were always affiliated with the mostly Skopje institutes. For instance, there were several such figures, mostly at the Research Institute of Sociology in Skopje. But nevertheless, I'm not quite sure as to which extent they were able to kind of escape this kind of major, more broad patterns of research, which were more or less ready-made, and kind of provide their sort of insights to this extent. As far as I know, the several mostly articles which I read in Macedonian are mostly in line with what was being written before. What else can be said in this regard? Yes, I mean, again, against this kind of sub-periodization into three, the whole idea of kind of re-elevating this sort of notion of interethnic relations into in a rather more modern format was again the one of the structuring features of the 60s. And here, for instance, the vast majority of sociologists again were preoccupied with this very notion of modernization, mostly modernization of the local Albanian community. And this is again a discourse which was more or less predominant in these regards. I'm not sure about the rest of the sub questions, but yeah, again, I mean, as for I think there was a question about Marxist, non-Marxist approaches. Yes, this becomes pretty kind of visible immediately after the 90s, but nevertheless there are also some sort of hints and bits of mostly American industrial sociology, let's say, but also other sort of ethnic contact and other similar theories, and this is even traceable back to the 80s. Not necessarily it's kind of based upon a more kind of structured research, but it's rather a way of domesticating some sort of different non-socialist or non-Marxist discourses for this very local context. But again, it's not done in a way to kind of to structure a new research question or a guiding principle in this regard. There are other interesting attempts, mostly in the 2000s, and here again the context is different. It's rather also a question of funding of research and so on. There are other similar attempts of applying different sort of theories to the interethnic relations, but again, this is not. It's a very kind of individualized research perspective, and it's not something which even ends up as a separate monograph, I would say even. So it's more or less a fragmented set of research based on kind of personal initiatives, I would say. As for dialogue is a very interesting case of I mean, again, in the book I'm discussing it, I'm kind of juxtaposing it to Pogledi, which was the more kind of official outlet. In the 60s, it was a dialogue before dialogues, and it was this kind of very progressive outpost where Milosavljeski was mostly publishing, but all these other kind of, in a way, revisionist sociologists and social sciences. But again, in the 70s, due to the different kind of political shifts, dialogue is taking the place of this more kind of radical, I would say, even it's not radical per se, but in a way there is a clear kind of nuance of what is being published where and by whom. This period, I'm discussing this period, it's very interesting, and thank you for this question and for the opportunity to kind of to reflect a bit more on this point. This very idea of a small sociological community in the 70s, which is in a rather precarious situation of lacking, like funding first and foremost, but also, like literal sidelining of their kind of expertise in the public space. They're even navigating between these kind of different outlets and the networks which are and the circles which are surrounding them. And it's very interesting to see how like the same people are writing different things for the different kind of outputs. So that's the journals is one very kind of clear example, but also there is, and I'm discussing this in the book, there is this there is this networking kind of scheme of these more senior professors, which are also involving this kind of, they're becoming the center of the dogmatic thought in Yugoslavia. So as of the 70s, Nedeljković is returning to Skopje again. So again, this kind of rather different developments that was happening in Belgrade, Zagreb, or even Ljubljana. But again, this younger generation, the students, mostly kind of using these opportunities of the young Marxist schools, which are never in Skopje, so they're either in Ohrid. It's a very interesting kind of spatial diffusion. They're discussing rather different themes than discussed by this kind of more senior fellows. So if, like, for instance, the seniors are discussing this Marxian thought in different kind of formats, from agriculture to different things. The youngsters are engaging with more kind of pressing issues of ecology, for instance, and so on. So it's a very interesting dynamic, reflecting upon the journals, but also this kind of networking schemes, and also reflecting this strategic choices of navigating between the two poles of research in this relatively small kind of community. As for Anastas, yeah, I mean, it's a very, very good question, and I think I do not have a definite response here. What I find not necessarily problematic, but what I find kind of I mean, I kind of argue that there is a certain extent of capital which sociologists are using from the late socialist period, and they're kind of even transposing into the post-socialist period, in which they're rather more impartial when it comes to these interethnic relations. But nevertheless, this national complex, given right now the Bulgarian issue and so on, you can see that the newest trajectories are again into kind of securitizing everything Macedonian here. So I think that the space for global perspectives is rather limited. I would say it's not necessarily the case. It's not necessarily the leading principle of these major centers, as far as I can see. So again, this kind of securitization of some identity-related issues is becoming a new thing, and it's in a way, I mean, going back to this capital from the late 80s and what was happening in the 90s and the 2000s. I mean, it's in a way it's losing its at least how I see it, it's losing its potential, I would say. So it's very rare to see a sociologist arguing something different than securitizing the in a way this ethnocentric discourse, I would say, which is in a way a pity. So yeah.
Are there any more questions? Okay, in that case, we will thank you again. And before ending this session, I just want to invite everyone 2 weeks from now, on November 26th, for the next session of History on the Edge with Sena Šimek. She will speak about the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, on Croatia's role in the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina and domestic reactions. So join us in 2 weeks, again at 3 p.m. And thank you very much, Naum, for being with us and for giving us this wonderful overview. Congratulations on your book. We hope for many more book discussions in the future. And thank you everyone in the audience, physically and online.
Thanks.